Our gospel reading this evening comes from the Gospel according to John, the 13th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. Now before the festival of the Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The devil had already put it into the heart of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray him. And during the supper, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, got up from the table, took off his outer robe, and tied a towel around himself. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet, and to wipe them with the towel that was tied around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus answered, "You do not know now what I am doing, but later you will understand." Peter said to him, "You will never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no share with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head." Jesus said to him, "One who is bathed does not need to wash, except for the feet, but is entirely clean. And you are clean, though not all of you." For he knew who was to betray him. For this reason he said, "Not all of you are clean." After he had washed their feet, had put on his robe, and had returned to the table, he said to them, "Do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for that is what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have set you an example, that you also should do as I have done to you. Very truly, I tell you, servants are not greater than their master, nor are messengers greater than the one who sent them. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them. Now the Son of Man has been glorified, and God has been glorified in him. If God has been glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself, and will glorify him at once. Little children, I am with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and as I said to the Jews, so now I say to you, where I am going, you cannot come. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. The Gospel of our Lord. So there we have it. The Gospel, according to John, recounts a story not of the Last Supper, but a story of Christ serving his disciples by washing their feet, something usually tasked to the servants of the house. In Jesus' time, this was unheard of. If your teacher, your superior, were to do this, then they would become your inferior. See, your superior cannot also be your servant. That isn't how society works in that time. To be honest, it isn't how society works in this day and age either. There are steps in the ladder to success, and it is very rare that we see those above us serving us or those beneath us. And yet Jesus does this exact thing. He turns expectations on their head once again, something that While we never really know what Jesus is going to do, we know that whatever it is, it's probably going to be unexpected. Something out of the norm, something that raises our eyebrows, makes us think about the world and how it functions. In this time of staying at home, of self-distancing, of self-quarantining, in this time of a great pandemic, we are invited to do this as well. To consider the norms of the world that had been, and invited by Christ in this space to come up with new norms that will be our truth and our lives moving forward. We've had to recognize the fact that while we can live without sports, without talk show hosts and crowded gathering spaces, we cannot live without the services provided to us by those whom society would deem as inferior. Our grocery store workers, our restaurant employees, those in the service industries taking care of water, electricity, of our mail, truck drivers, and nurses. While some of these positions hold higher status than others, it's interesting in this day and age to consider what this world would be like without any of those individuals. We are faced with the reality that our expectations of the world, that it is the higher-ups, the CEOs, the leaders who make the world run smoothly, have been challenged with the realization that without the workers, those on the bottom, nothing could function. A CEO is only as good as the workers that he or she is in charge of. So I invite you in this time to consider with Jesus. Consider the service in the world. That rather than searching for power, for prestige, that we search for those who are in need of service. Whether society would dictate those to be our superiors or inferiors, if they are in need of service, Christ calls us to serve them. In this season of service, of waiting, anticipation, in these holy days, we may mourn the loss of the norms that we are used to. We may mourn the loss of Easter brunches, Easter egg hunts, displaying our beautiful Sunday morning clothing. We may mourn the ability to gather together with friends and family and worship and sing together. And yet, having to stop these activities does not mean having to stop believing in and serving our Lord. Quite the opposite. As we strip away all the non-essentials of the world, as we strip away all the things that we packed into these days to make them more memorable, to share them with others, what we are left with is something even more precious. Taking away all the window dressings, we realize the reason we gather together is not for any of those things. but it is to learn from Christ, to be reminded that we are servants of the world, that like Christ, we have a responsibility to serve those in need. As followers of Christ, we are encouraged not to seek fame and fortune, but to seek to end famine and war. We are invited not to dress up and show off our wealth, to gather together and risk the lives of others, but to sit in silence together, to pray for the world, to pray that we might hear God's voice in that void and hear how God is calling us to serve our neighbors. I invite you this evening to join with me, to find ways to take this time and consider what gifts Christ has given to us. Even when we cannot wash one another's feet, we can serve each other in different ways. Perhaps this is the greatest gift given to the church, because we are forced out of the mentality of we've always done it this way, and instead faced with the question, how do we faithfully follow Christ now? I don't have the answer as to how that will manifest itself in your lives, because it's going to be different for every single person. But I encourage you to take this time, this evening, to sit in silence, whether it's for 20 seconds, 20 minutes, or the rest of the night, to consider that call, that small whisper in our minds that's usually drowned out by all the other distractions of the world. Sit with that voice and hear how God is calling you to service and to love your neighbor. Amen.